That is true. He says it right. That's my right. I say the things that I think. I have a lot of liberty on the air, and it's still a free country, so I have that right, and nobody's responsible for the information I put out. Meanwhile, we'll begin officially with the program this evening. It is broadcast number 618. It's October the 10th, 1983. And before I begin, I want to ask if anybody who takes the broadcast or has the tapes or sheets or is expertise at indexing. I have the list of sheets that accompany the broadcast going back as far as 1977. And I want to get them out as a book, but I also want to use them for references because often there's past programs where I referred to certain incidences. And I want to be able to pull those out. And I will pay somebody if they are good at indexing and want a job indexing these sheets. They could do that. They can call me. My number is listed in the book. Or if you're farther away, you can write to me. I really need these indexed in a professional manner where I have access to the books I've mentioned, the chronology of the years I have had on the air, different names and incidences, all the names indexed in a proper way where I can get my fingers on them. Now, this last week, Larry Flynt, the publisher of Hustler, ordered the copy of last broadcast, number 617. He had ordered a set for every member of Congress, for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. That's about 535 cassettes that are going out this week. He's serious about it. He began to take the tapes, and he thought that was an important broadcast. That's the one last week about Lieutenant General Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency and his links with Fritz Kramer in Washington, D.C., and also his links to Western Goals, and Larry McDonald and his links to John Reese and Larry McDonald. And then there's a section on Roy Cohn with Western Goals, and Roy Cohn is written up in the Talbott document with the role with Permindex in the assassination of John Kennedy. He helped prosecute the Rosenbergs. He had the House Un-American Activities for Senator Joe McCarthy. And the whole era is wrapped up in these particular names that are very important, Roy Cohn and General Graham and Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, and so forth. And it goes into Larry McDonald and his links to the military and also to the great blackmailers, the people like Roy Cohn who know all the scandals. Roy Cohn was the attorney for Alfred Bloomingdale, and his friend Mr. Mitchelson was the attorney for Vicki Morgan. And so Larry Flynt sent a check of several $1,000s plus more, almost $3,000, to get the tapes duplicated and to be sent to every member of Congress. This time last year, on broadcast number 566, that was October the 11th, 1982, I was talking about Fritz Kramer and the Pentagon again. I had written to the Subcommittee on Immigration and Refugees and International Law. That was just a year ago that I wrote to the chairman and every member of this subcommittee because they had hearings on Nazi war criminals and their illegal entry into the United States. And I asked them if perchance a criminal named number 33 at the Dachau trial did come to the United States, and if he was the head of the Pentagon at this time, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, where does he fit into this? Now, I sent letters. I have the letters, the postal certifications. I didn't get an answer from one of those members of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Refugees. And I asked them some very serious questions. I gave a lot of references, but I got nothing from a single one of them. We also talked last year on the fairy tale business, an article in Forbes magazine about Grace Kelly. It was just at the time that she had been murdered. And her role at 20th Century Fox, which they mentioned, that she was on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox that was purchased by Marvin Davis in August 81. And I talked about Henry Kissinger. See, all these names, as you're catching on now, are beginning to really overlap the organizations, the institutions, to Western Goals, to the LAPD. But I talked about Henry Kissinger and Edward Bennett Williams being put on the board of 20th Century Fox, along with Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission, and John Hinckley Jr. was represented by Edward Bennett Williams. That was a year ago I was talking about that. Well, this past week, Mark Rich, who owns 50% of 20th Century Fox, to update you on the latest story, was officially indicted. He was being investigated by the grand jury. The Washington Post has a front page story. Jury indicts Mark Rich and others in the largest tax evasion case. And it tells how they have named him and his friend Pincus Green and another member of his group, Clyde Meltzer, Meltzer. Now, they have charged him with some very serious charges, 51-count indictment. It's not just for not paying taxes. It's not just tax evasion indictment. It goes a lot further. And what the grand jury said, besides concealing the $100 million in taxes, a nice round sum, that he was illegally buying more than $200 million worth of oil from Iran after President Jimmy Carter banned the trade with that nation during the hostage crisis. The president means nothing, whether it's John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy at the time of the Bay of Pigs said there's a hidden government behind my back. The hidden government is there, and these people issue an order, no trading with Iran while the hostages are there. So Mark Rich, a fellow who puts Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and William Rogers, all of them together at the 20th Century Fox, they're all part and parcel of the Iranian situation, making profits of it, millions of dollars for themselves. And who pays the difference? The oil prices go up, the profits go in their pocket. Well, Rich was sending $200 million worth of oil from Iran after Carter banned the trade with the nation. And at first they weren't clear where it was going. But the United States banks, 7 of them this week, have tried to stop the government from trying up $100 million of Mark Rich's money because they claim that the banks need the money. The United States banks transferred funds from the United States, identical to what Hitler did just when the war was over in Germany, transferred from the United States, and it ended up in the hands of the National Iranian Oil Company. And then they were selling it to South Africa, which was illegal. They were sending it from Soviet bloc nations to South Africa and from Iran to the United States and Europe during the embargo. So this is the activity of Mark Rich with his heavy cast of characters, including Grace Kelly on the board of that studio. And now he's taken residence in Spain. He said he's not an American citizen. He was a Belgian-born American citizen. Now he's off in Spain because he doesn't want to count to the law, and you can figure out why. So that's the latest on the oil scandal of Mark Rich. Now, Cardinal Cook passed away last week, just this last Thursday, and there isn't too much to say about that. His name surfaced in a political sense. Well, all Catholic cardinals are political. At the time, John DeLorean was arrested because he was seeing him so frequently. But in an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, it said that his funeral will be attended by former President Richard Nixon, as well as U.S. senators, including Alphonse D'Amato from New York City. Now, Nixon was heavily involved with the Vatican, with Michael Sindona, with Paul Marcinkus. You read the Vatican Connection. That book goes back 10 years, and Sindona funding Nixon $1 million during the Republican campaign in 1968. He's been heavily funded for his activities by the Vatican, and that's probably because of his role since 1946 of bringing the Nazis from Project Paperclip into the United States. But this New York Senator D'Amato is not only close, of course, to the Cardinal, but his name surfaced again this week in terms of the Flight 007 and a pathetic situation that he's put his name to as a propaganda ploy, which proves that the Vatican that funded Richard Nixon and the various candidates, Licio Gelli funded Ronald Reagan and so forth, the Vatican is a very political animal, and they get into situations such as provocation, such as 007. The Washington Times had an article this week, September 28th, that a 28-year-old man from Salem, Oregon, has enlisted the aid of Vice President Bush and his area congressman to sell buttons to commemorate the 007 that went down in the Soviet Union. Now, if you want to buy a button or donate cash directly, you send your contribution to, this is the address, USSR, United States Shall Remember, P.O. Box 13916, Salem, Oregon, 97309. That reminds me of Julie Eisenhower when her father was vice president for 8 years, and they left the White House. She slipped a note under the rug and said, "We will return." And then a little while later, she was back, and her father was president of the United States. Now, the fund for this operation also is carried in New York. They have assistants in New York under Alphonse D'Amato. I have trouble always pronouncing his name. It's not that hard. And the proceeds go to the U.S. National Bank account in Oregon, but the foundation is set up for the Korean victims in care of Representative Alphonse D'Amato, Republican, New York. The address is this: the Soviet Massacre Assistance Fund, P.O. Box 007. Isn't that cute? 007, Washington, D.C., 20013. I think you should send for the button because they'll be collector's items. I have a button collection, and I think that's pretty neat. But they'll be wearing these buttons for a long time unless we do something about exposing what really happened on Flight 007, just as some people have been working very hard to expose the lie that Agca, who shot the Pope and tried to kill him, was working with the Bulgarian CIA, and I'll go into that in a moment. Now, Cardinal Medeiros died in Boston. He was active in civil rights, and with his death, at least 4 appointments for the Pope to make cardinals in the United States right after he made the appointment of the Jesuit, the head of Jesuits, and he forced the former head to resign, which is never done. A Jesuit head lives through his lifetime like a justice of the Supreme Court. But there was an article about Cardinal Medeiros in the paper regarding his death in the Washington Post, and it said that when he was selected by Pope Paul VI, that's Montini, from the Milan Mafia, when he was selected to become a cardinal in Boston, and was sent there to replace Mr. Cushman, the Cardinal Cushing, from Boston. The Boston church there had a debt of $42 million. That wasn't so long ago, 1970. That was just 12, 13 years ago. And they had a debt of $42 million, which is quite a lot of money. And he was brought in. Goodness knows where that money went, because the Vatican has paid for politicians or men. Who knows if it goes into the election of D'Amato? Who knows where it goes? I'm not saying it did. We don't know. As a matter of fact, a year ago this evening, I was talking about the scandal of Cardinal Cody in Chicago, and when the information came out about the woman that he had on full salary and the location of a special office or condominium down in Florida, New York Times last year had a story about the missing millions that Cardinal Cody was responsible for from the First National Bank and the Continental Bank in Illinois. The Continental was tied up with the Tylenol scandal a year ago that hasn't been covered. So he had missing millions when he left there, and when Cushing left Boston and Medeiros took over, there was $42 million there. And it's really imperative to know, we'll never know, of course, if Sedona gives Nixon $1 million, did each of the senators and House of Representatives who vote like knuckleheads, what did they get? I mean, you couldn't handpick a bunch of jerks that we have in Washington unless somebody was paying their way, because you can't vote en masse without any reason or logic as we get closer to nuclear war. Now, regarding the South Korean leaders that were killed just yesterday, there's a story in the San Francisco Chronicle that the president of Korea immediately blamed the North Korean agents. It's in the San Francisco Chronicle, October the 10th, and it's a wire service story. And also it's in the New York Times. And Chun told the Burmese government that he hoped the investigation and the arrest of the culprits will come soon, and they will be severely punished. He should punish them while he exposes the plot instigated by North Korea. Another instant solution. The moment Diem was murdered in South Korea, and his partner, Mr. New, the husband of Madam New, living in Bel Air, she says, a communist killed my husband. The moment John Kennedy died, the John Birch Society that brought their 29 people from Munich, Germany, out to Dallas for that explicit occasion were publishing a communist killed the president. First, they had banners wanted for treason because he was too far left. And then after he was dead and conveniently out of the way, and their oil tax depletion allowance wouldn't be put on their head, and the nuclear test ban treaty they could turn over, and all the dirty tricks they could get into once he was dead, then they had, the communists killed him. He worked for the communists, but he's killed by the commies. When Korean Airline 003 went down, immediately the communists did it. Not that it was a provocation, knowing that territory without response would require death. when Aquino died in the Philippines. Marco, the first day and even yesterday, I cut out an article, the communists killed him. The man who shot Aquino in the Philippines worked for the Air Force, worked for the mafia, but here is Marco saying the communists killed him. So now Mr. Chun is saying the North Koreans did it. Get them. And it's like an order to Burma. You've got to get them. Now, a little history, a 2-minute capsule of history in Korea. In June 29th of 1979, Jimmy Carter, the same president that ordered the embargo stopped of the oil that Mark Rich and Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer ignored. On June 29th, 1979, Jimmy Carter ordered the withdrawal of troops in South Korea. We had 32,000 combat troops. You know what the cost of that is. And he ordered them brought home. And in October 26, 1979, Park Chung-hee was at a dinner party with, he was the president of Korea. He was with the head of his Korean CIA, which is set up by our CIA, and he was killed by Kim Jae-kyu, K-Y-U. That's October, just a few months after the president ordered our withdrawal. And then in comes the current president, Chun Doo-hwan, and he takes over. Now, in between those two times, when Jimmy Carter said withdraw the troops, this is the time when all the Korea Gate was going on, the bribing of the congressman, Leon Jaworski covering it up as he did the House Select, well, didn't work for the House Select, the Warren Commission, and also for the Senate Watergate hearings. They brought in Leon Jaworski of the CIA and got everyone off of the charges of Tongson Park paying off the congressman, providing him second wives and mistresses and so forth. So in June, Carter wanted the troops out. In August, the Korea Gate scandal was finalizing and coming to a head. And in October, the president of Korea was offed by the head of the Korean CIA, and then the Army general took over, and this same Army general worked with the pilot of 007, who was also in the Army. So when you want to get the troops out, and troops are good business, and you need them in South Korea, you create a crisis, which they did, like the Gary Powers U-2 incident over the Soviet Union to break up D'Entente. When you want to remove the U.S. troops from their foothold halfway around the world, just create an incident, and then the troops stay. And Jimmy Carter didn't have much effect on Korean politics any more than he did on the oil crisis, by which certain people accrued millions and millions of dollars. Now, last week I was talking about the General Graham and his Political Action Committee, and offering up front $1 million to candidates who would go for the space weapons. And this last September the 2nd, last month, Jack Anderson had a story, Intriguing Tale of Oil Tycoons' Machinations. This is about Esso Oil, Tom Pappas' oil company, and an interesting $15 million deal. Pappas was a major fundraiser and contributor for the 1968 campaign of Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, his running mate, who was to be the highest elected official of the Greek-American background. And in Greece, the Esso people put up money for Spiro Agnew. Jack Anderson said the Pappas enterprises were alleged to be fronts for the CIA operation in Greece when the CIA put in the military junta, put them into power. More serious were the charges that the CIA funds found their way back through Pappas to the United States into the Nixon-Agnew campaign fund. Now, Jack Anderson said last month, if Nixon got his hands on U.S. Treasury money indirectly through the CIA, it's a scandal of the first magnitude. And he tells how the money trail led from the CIA to its Greek counterpart, the KYP, then to Tom Pappas, back to the United States, into the Nixon-Agnew campaign. And furthermore, he says that Larry O'Brien, at the time of Watergate and even before, who was chairman of the Democratic National Committee, wouldn't release this information and kept it secret. Nixon could have been defeated, except that the Democrats work for the assassination teams, and they have since John Kennedy was killed. I just read this week that another top-level person working with Richard Nixon, I have to think of who it was now, is now working with Robert Gray, the public relations man. Frank Mankiewicz, who was one of the people that John Kennedy trusted, who has always worked with intelligence operations. Frank Mankiewicz is now working for Bob Gray, the man whose offices were shared with Edwin Wilson when George Bush was in the CIA. These are the kind of Democrats you have, Mankiewicz and Larry O'Brien or Hubert Humphrey, who were all paid out of the same till. Larry O'Brien, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, had in a press conference and released a statement demanding that Nixon and Agnew explain their relationship. I didn't see it. Did you see it? I didn't see what he said, but I knew that it was happening because in my first published article for The Realist in 1972, after Richard Nixon his men were apprehended at the Watergate Hotel, I compared the military coup that took place in Greece by the Greek military junta to the plans of Squad 19 to overthrow the government, the United States government, in 1972 at the Republican conventions in San Diego. And I wrote that the CIA that helped fund canceling elections in Greece offered Richard Nixon the money he needed for his 1968 election if he took political unknown Spiro Agnew as vice president. And I said that money to manage an election campaign is difficult enough to separate. But when you mix your CIA funds with Republican or Democratic money, how do you know that all the agents, all the candidates aren't CIA? In 1968, Nixon was offered through CIA conduit Tom Pappas and other sources the funding he needed for the election if he took Agnew as vice president. And then I went on to the Young Americans for Freedom, which I won't go into tonight, which are the group of Robert Morris and Colonel Willoughby and Ronald Reagan and the people that came from Germany to Dallas and were a part of the John Kennedy assassination that I've done many times. Now, there was a small article, it doesn't have to be very big, just a little article in the magazine section of the Monterey Herald and some syndicated papers, the Family Weekly, just yesterday. And it's from the Ask Editors. Los Angeles, this is the story, just 2 paragraphs, really. There's a major drug scandal brewing in Hollywood, and sources involved say that when it breaks, the resulting controversy will be one of the messiest in decades. That's some competition. Sources close to the case say investigators have turned up evidence that high-ranking police department officials have been directly involved in drug traffic. This is what I said with Jack Eggers and Bobby Hall and Louis Tackwood, and the drugs that were supplied to the rock musicians or the Lenny Bruces and the Janis Joplins. Let's go back to what they say, that the police are involved in drug trafficking. Additionally, the investigators have learned that Kathy Smith, indicted by a grand jury on a charge of administering a fatal dose of heroin and cocaine to actor John Belushi, obtained those drugs from a girlfriend of a high-ranking police official. That's the John Belushi that felt sorry for El Salvador. That's the John Belushi that got on NBC to make fun of Henry Kissinger with his marvelous comedies on Saturday Night Live. The John Belushi who works not only for NBC, but so does Johnny Carson with his CIA connections to Robert Duran and Jack Cotain and the whole makeup of his bank that's in scandalous headlines right now, and I'll do more, if not tonight, later. That the kind of drugs that these people get that are fatal when they are particularly political, I have been suspicious of, and a lot of people say, well, you know Janis was on drugs. You knew Belushi took drugs. He may have taken drugs. I had an argument with a friend about that in New York who was a friend of his. He says, oh, get off of it. Belushi took drugs. That's not the point. If Jackie Smith is on probation and she leaves the scene or stays and calls 911 and says he dies suddenly and there's not a trace of drugs, because she can clear them all out. But what she did was that she left after he was dead, took a phone call, came back 2 hours later with a spoon and white cocaine and hands it to the police. So that at that point, they could have put her in jail. But the police, if you remember the tapes I did, they couldn't arrest her because I knew she worked with the Los Angeles Police Department. So they let her go to Canada. On the way to Canada, she almost had a fatal car crash. She broke some ribs. She got up to Canada, and she wrote a story for the National Enquirer on how she killed John Belushi, and the LAPDs were frantic. They don't want her back for trial. She's opened her big mouth. So finally, they had a grand jury hearing, and she was indicted, but they haven't extradited her. On top of the Johnny Carson and the Henry Bushkin story and what's coming out, and Mr. Saxon, what's coming out of L.A. with the cocaine connections in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas and Colombia and the Klaus Barbie links down in South America to Bolivia, you can believe they don't want this to unravel. Be interesting to see how far this goes, but that was in the paper yesterday. Another article in the paper, that something I've been harping on for a long time, from the Washington Post. This is September 18th, 1983. It's about war in space. On the front page, it says, United States prepares for the day when war may be waged in space. They're planning this, and Representative Ken Kramer, Kramer, from Colorado, wants to change the name of the Air Force, he's serious, to the U.S. Aerospace Force, that the Defense Intelligence Agency and all powers that be and NASA want it, and he has a symbol of how it will look, the new emblem, the U.S. Aerospace Force. And then in big black letters it says, military prepares for the day when those who control space can expect to control the entire world. Now, whenever I'm asked about the John Kennedy assassination or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, I say, get the book Project Paperclip and read how the Nazi scientists were brought to this country via Richard Nixon and a lot of other people in office today, and Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger. Project Paperclip, the goal of those Germans was to have the Fourth Reich and to control the world. And this time they were going to do it so that Mr. Dornberger, again, Project Paperclip, to be dumped on the dust heap of the world and hung in Nuremberg, is taken out to Bell Aerospace. He manages that company that made huge profits in the Vietnam War, over in Iran, and world crisis all over the world, police departments and whatever. The point is that the Dornberger, the war criminal, was there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and his company hired Michael Payne, the host, and safe house for Lee and Marina Oswald. And I've talked about Project Paperclip and Alternative 3 for a long, long time, and any of you who want the tapes of those broadcasts can get them. Here's another horror story. You'll think that I'm making this up because it's close to Halloween, but I'm not. This is all in 1 week's news. They came out different days, but I just read them all in the past week since I was with you last week. Wall Street Journal, September 26, 1983. The Hughes Tool Company agrees to merge with W.R. Grace and Company. That should be making the headlines inches high. Hughes Tool Company was the company that Howard Hughes' father formed when he invented the tool bit that J. Paul Getty said, without that bit, without what his father had invented, we would all still be making quarters somewhere else that we couldn't. We'd have to dig the oil with our hands. This tool bit company was very valuable. It began the career of Howard Hughes in Houston, Texas. And when the tool company was sold in 1972, there was no Howard. From what I can see or what I've studied, he was deep sixed by Onassis, as I wrote for Playgirl a long time ago, over off of Greek Island. And Vance Cooper was the double in that grave. And the point about the Hughes story is that I said that the Howard Hughes organization, through Carl Boyer, Byoir, and the public relations firm, has been the umbrella for the Fourth Reich, along with the space project, along with all the other things I'm telling you, for the Nazification of America. And now we have Mr. J. Peter Grace from the W.R. Grace Company, who appointed John Reese to be on Western Goals to gather and suck in information, hundreds of millions of pieces they could put into, I don't know how many, if there's 2 million names, the LAPD alone. Western Goals, Larry McDonald's outfit, has computers. It's been verified in many other cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles. They can have computers in every major city in the United States and feed every police department and put names into these computers. So that Grace not only is a close associate of the aging Otto Ambrose, the chemist from I.G. Farben, the man who created slave labor and extermination and gas camps. And we have the Auschwitz Pope, who was an actor at Solvay Chemical working for I.G. Farben, and Hermann Abs of the Deutsche Bank, the man who supported Hitler and wrote the paychecks, is a banker for the Vatican. Don't you see what is coming down now with the man who wrote for Himmler? And for Hitler, the paychecks is a financier with the Pope in the Vatican. Mr. J. Peter Grace works with Edward Teller and Admiral Moore and the late Larry McDonald and John Reese and the top military brass who funnel in for the police departments. And now the tool company is to merge. And the interesting thing is that they said they would merge now because they each lost a total of $120 million last year. Now, is that $120 million on the books, or did that buy our congressman or put the Larry McDonalds into Congress? I'm sure it did. Hughes Tool Company lost $40 million or Grace lost 20 million and Hughes lost 80 million. And do you really believe that they lost it any more than the Boston Cardinal Cushing lost 40 million when he turned over his diocese? We'll take a 1-minute break now and then get back to the second half of this litany of horrors. And would you believe it? It even gets worse. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 618, and it's October the 10th, 1983. I saved some of the horrors for the last, or not the last. This is in the middle. This is one of the most disgusting stories I have to share with you. I've been waiting to see where Evelle Younger was or is. Evelle Younger, for those of you who don't know him, was the district attorney in Los Angeles when Sirhan Sirhan was prosecuted for shooting Robert Kennedy, and he let Thane Cesar, a Nazi organizer right now, off the hook. Thane Cesar came from Lockheed under the Howard Hughes organization again. That's the group that used Robert Mayhew and John Rosselli, Sam Giancana, organized crime, and the hit teams from the crime syndicate. Now, he prosecuted Sirhan Sirhan and would not admit evidence of the second gun. If you get Good Housekeeping this month on the front cover and inside, there's an article based on a new book by Thomas Noguchi, the coroner, saying that there was another person in the Ambassador Hotel and there was a second gun. Well, if there was, this is the man that let him off. And he also worked with Peter Pitches on the story. The saga of the SLA is the CIA, and with the Manson family, the CIA operation for counterterrorism to come down and distrust hippies and musicians, and the prison riots in all over up and down the state of the Soledad brothers and the Judge Haley that was killed and the San Quentin Six. Younger was part and parcel, as was Ronald Reagan, through those 8 years, and Edwin Meese, of the total bloodbath that went on in those 8 years. So wouldn't you know, with the Olympics coming up and et cetera, out of the woodwork comes Evelle Younger. Well, what do you think he has for you for the November ballot? Let me tell you what he has. He's been working on a jury system, and he wants to change the jury from 10 to 2, that you would be guilty if 10 people find you guilty, even if you're innocent. You don't need a 12-man jury to say you're innocent. You could be convicted by 10 people. This article from the L.A. Herald says the proposed state constitutional amendment, whose sponsors include Los Angeles County District Attorney Robert Filibosian and former State Attorney General Evelle Younger, is being circulated for the November 1984 ballot. Its numerous provisions include authority, listen to this, the 10 to 2 jury verdict in everything but death penalty, a revival of the system of closed-door grand jury indictments. Those were the terrors of the 60s that really got people laid back and in trouble. Questioning of prospective jurors by judges rather than lawyers. Now, keep in mind that many of these judges are appointed by Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and you-know-who, and so the judge would weed out the jurors if they look too liberal or too simplistic and make sure that he gets people from the Bechtel Corporation, such as were on the Dan White case in San Francisco. And he would restrict the defendant's right at preliminary hearings. Now, the criminal charge is to be made by the grand jury alone. That's what he wants, without requiring an open court preliminary hearing. That's to reverse a 1978 state Supreme Court decision. He wants to overthrow that. He wants to reverse another state Supreme Court ruling that required prospective jurors in death penalty cases to be questioned separately from one another on their views about capital punishment. They don't want anyone on a jury who's against capital punishment. They will allow judges to conduct all questioning, as I said before, of the jurors. Now, here's the one that really will grab you if you're not scared yet. About the space stations and the use with grace, they will allow a defendant to be held for trial by either a grand jury or a preliminary hearing solely on the basis of hearsay testimony, a witness or a document that reports what someone else said to prove the truth that out-of-court statement. That any forged document, any person who hates you, any snitching. Remember back on broadcast number 612, I was telling about the tragedy that Klaus Barbie's going to start in France because he's going to name people who turned in members of their families, fathers and mothers that turned in their children and children that turned in their parents. Everybody was a snitch, saving his behind. And so now the story is that you can be held by the testimony of somebody, hearsay testimony. We're going back to the Middle Ages. And then he says in preliminary hearings, they would prohibit defendants from trying to dismiss the charge on grounds of double jeopardy or lack of a speedy trial. In other words, you can stay in 4 or 5 years and forget it. And they will restrict the evidence and witnesses a defendant can use present at the hearings. They will restrict your evidence and your witnesses, so you have to go through a lengthy, expensive trial because you can't bring in your witnesses when they nail you down. Now, for example, this is the Evelle Younger suggestion that he wants just coming out of the woodwork at this time. I can't believe we can be set back as we're being set back after the few pieces of progress that were made after Watergate. Now, there's an article, not an article, it's an ad, in the Washington Times. I call it the D.C. Times. If any of you don't take it and you want the address, call me and I'll get it for you, or maybe look it up in the library. It's the Reverend Moon paper, but it's invaluable, and it's the cheapest paper on the market. It's only $19 a month. And that's where you get the social columns of Roy Cohn with Richard Vagary and Mr. Mitchelson, the lawyer for Vicky Morgan, rather. And the wonderful social columns, and all the right-wing organizations list their board of directors. They're not embarrassed by that. So they have a committee now, a declaration of support for the Nicaraguan Freedom Fighters. And this is everybody who wants to get into Nicaragua and take over where Somoza did, the rape of Nicaragua. They had their chance. Somoza went to West Point and turned it into a battlefield. He had his chance. But now these people, interesting enough, if I have time, I'm going to read you some of the names on the list to show you the political clout that people who came to this country as foreigners now show and can push on the president and collect names and organizations. Scary as hell, and maybe we'll go into them. One of the committees is Dr. Brutus Coast from the Truth About Romania Committee. Many people from the Eastern Europe, where the Nazis came over through various operations like the Belarusa Secret describes in its book. Now, just a few names on this list. There's about 150. There's Robert Morris, the fellow that works with Richard Vagary and the late Larry McDonald, and with the military and with the space station, and Dr. Graham and Gerard O'Neill up in Houston, Texas, who helped fund the Young Americans for Freedom from Munich, Germany, when Kennedy was killed. Robert Morris lists himself as the National Committee to Restore Internal Security. If Evelle Younger wants to go back to the antiquated court systems, he wants the Internal House Select Committee, the House On-American Activity. That's one of the people. John T. Dolan from the National Conservative Political League. Then he's got some interesting names. Lieutenant General Daniel O. Graham from High Frontier. Again, as I mentioned before, working with John Reese, who's part of the J. Peter Grace group. Graham is the partner of Fritz Kramer in Washington, and he works with the Western Goals, Larry McDonald, and Roy Cohn gang. He's a Roy Cohn that I mentioned, Daniel Graham. Now, one of the names here that's very interesting that you may not remember or don't know at all, among these 150 names is Lieutenant General C.M. Talbott, Chief of Staff, Military Order of the World Wars. You like that one? The Military Order of the World Wars. Now, Talbott is working with Mr. Graham, and I presume Mr. Kramer, and Robert Morris, the same gang. And Talbott's name came to me a long time ago. I've had it on the air for you before, but some of you don't know the name, and it's new now because it comes in conjunction with the Howard Hughes Tool Company joining with J. Peter Grace and W.R. Grace and Company, and also with Daniel Graham buying the elections and the control of Howard Hughes for taking over America, the Nazification of America. The process began, according to the book of Noah Dietrich, he doesn't refer to it in those terms, The Amazing Mr. Hughes by Noah Dietrich in 1972. And he tells in 1953 how the new Republican administration had taken office. That's General Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, president and vice president. And Dietrich says, guess who showed up as Secretary of the Air Force when the new Republican administration took over? And Nixon was the protege of Howard Hughes. Guess who shows up as Secretary of the Air Force? Harold Talbott, the same guy who's now working with these committees to get the Nicaraguan slave labor going again. The same Harold Talbott who had been affronted by the snub of Howard Hughes a few years back when he wanted his brother, now dead, on the board of TWA that Howard owned. The same Talbott who turned down his nose when Howard offered him $25,000 contribution to the Dewey campaign in 1948. Talbott flew out to California with fire in his eyes, and he said to Howard Hughes this at the Beverly Hills Hotel, this is 1953, "You personally have wrecked a great industrial establishment with gross mismanagement. I don't give a damn what happens to you, but I'm concerned for this country. The United States is wholly dependent on Hughes aircraft and their vital defense systems." And he said it was a mistake to entrust it to you. Therefore, he says, I want you to either sell Hughes aircraft to Lockheed or accept a new management that I myself, the Secretary of the Air Force, runs. Now, you think Hughes is a private business, a private corporation with its privacy on the board because it's one name, Hughes? No, the Secretary of the Air Force goes to him and said, I don't give a damn to you about you. That was in 1953. By 1957, 4 years later, Howard was being drugged out of his head and given Perrier water and chocolate bars, and he was put into a projection room to watch movies over and over again. He began to deteriorate until 1966 when he was never seen again. He says, I don't give a damn about you. And Noah Dietrich says to him, well, wait a minute, we can't do this in 24 hours. He said, give us 90 days. Noah Dietrich says, give us 90 days. And Howard said, who in the hell does he think he is? Nobody, not even the Secretary of the Air Force, is going to dictate how I manage my plant. It is my plant. But without the Air Force contracts, there would be no Hughes aircraft. So he accepted Talbott's nominee to run Hughes aircraft, William Jordan, retired president of Curtiss Wright Aircraft. So 4 years later, Howard is out of commission. In 1953, the Hughes aircraft is run by the military on orders of the Secretary of the Air Force, and now in 1983, the Secretary of the Air Force, the same man, is working with the far-right fascist element of this country, the more extreme right element that is running this country and calling the shots. Now, this brochure, this ad in the Washington Times, had a list of foreign names and emigre, and I want to read you a letter to the editor. Just see what you think about this. It was in the Los Angeles Times because the police department made raids on 43 residences and broke in and broke down their places looking for one person, and they were in error. It wasn't in any of those 43 places. It was identical to the pogroms that took place in Tsarist Russia before the Tsars were overthrown. A man named H. Harashevsky, Harashevsky, wrote this letter called Police Raids. I don't really see why you found it necessary to devote so much space to your story on September 23rd regarding the police raids on 43 residences around the Southland. I understand this is common practice around the globe from Argentina to Zaire. Why should this country and a handful of others be different? Why doesn't he get the hell out of this country and go where he came from? Because this country is different, and let this dog in. Okay, let's continue the letter. After all, he says, I'm sure that most of those people, even those in no way connected to the motorcycle club in question, were guilty of something. You think this is getting pretty bad? Guilty of something, and the guiltiest probably doing the most whining about the trampling of some nebulous rights of them breaking down the doors and tearing into their homes. I am sure no decent law-abiding citizen would worry or would object to helping the police carry out their duties as an expeditious, far-reaching, and efficient manner as they see. The police, you help the police like Klaus Barbie did, and we'll get rid of these people. Furthermore, he says, it appears an inordinate amount of valuable time was lost in going through the obviously superfluous procedure of obtaining search warrants. Add that to what Evil Younger has cooked up and your space stations of Gerard O'Neill. Another horror story. Catching up on some of these and I'll go back to 007 next week, but I can't miss these stories with you, and there's a pile more. You might have read about the airplane of the CIA bombing Nicaragua, trying to get the Somoza elements back into Nicaragua, and they were using Intermountain Aviation Incorporated. That CIA airplane was the one that was used for melathion spraying in California last year. It's a CIA airplane. It's linked directly to Peru. The Base of J. Peter Grace and the Grace Family. There's a book, The Pirates of Peru. From Peru laboratory came hundreds of millions of fertile flies, and the result was that they got Jerry Brown out as senator to make him look soft and wishy-washy, and got Pete Smith, who's a friend of Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and the whole gang. They got Pete Wilson in as the senator. Now, the scandal of the Los Angeles Police Department, Western Goals, was that the police were accumulating files that were supposed to be destroyed in 1975, but were going into the computer of Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, and Larry McDonald of Murder Incorporated, and the Huzu Admiral Moore of the far right-wing military intelligence, with the links right up to Graham and Fritz Kramer and the data banks. That was in 1975, but I pulled out of my files this week an article in 1974 that material was ordered to be destroyed in 1971 that was in the hands of General Daniel Graham, at the time head of Defense Intelligence Agency, and the article reads, "Spying data retained by the Army." This is January the 11th, 1974. "The Army announced yesterday it has discovered counterintelligence files on political dissenters that were supposed to have been destroyed under a 1971 Defense Department directive." Here's Jimmy Carter saying there's an embargo on the oil. They sell the oil. Here's an order to destroy the files up to 1975. They're kept by the police and put into a $100,000 computer. Here's an order by the Defense Department directive, and General Daniel Graham of all these corporations and fronts is part of it, and they were ordered destroyed. The announcement of the Army Secretary Howard Callaway indicates the files on dissenters contain 400 microfilms that should have been destroyed. He said the files contain the results of military surveillance of American civilians prior to 71. Civilian spying by the military was targeted against draft-resistant movements, GI coffeehouses, and other anti-Vietnam War activities, and that the Army ascertained the files of one of its Washington, D.C. offices contains information relating to activities of American civilians that should have been purged before now. In a related development, senior government intelligence officials acknowledged yesterday that the CIA accumulated at least 2 sets of files on American citizens who figured in civil disturbances in the late 60s and in the early Nixon administration, and yet they were turning them over. They kept the names. There was a list from 9,000 to 12,000 names, and they were assembled, and another list of 10,000 names was brought by the CIA as a result of requests from domestic intelligence agencies for information from abroad on United States citizens. So what was to be destroyed in 71 wasn't. What was to be destroyed in 75 wasn't. And they involved the same people. Oh, hello. I heard a noise behind me. I didn't see the door open. Okay. Now, I want to mention the indictment, not the indictment yet, but the court case going on in Rome, Italy, regarding Mehmet Ali Agca, who said the Bulgarians and the KGB took a shot, asked him to take a shot at the Pope. The latest from the New York Times from Rome, September 29, says an Italian magistrate was reported today to be preparing a slander charge against the gunman who said that the Bulgarian agents masterminded both his attempt to kill the Pope and a plot to kill Lech Walesa. The magistrate, Ilario Martella, notified the Turkish gunman that he was to be indicted for slandering the Bulgarian airline employee who Agca implicated. He's in jail for attempted murder, and he wanted to get out if he told who was behind it, so he implicates Bulgarians and KGB. And after a long, extensive investigation, they found that Agca was a damn liar, and you don't see it in too many headlines. It was the front page of the New York Times, September 30th, 1983. So that story is, I should think, would be over. I don't know where Michael Ledeen is, or Claire Sterling, or Robert Moss and the Terror Network. You know, when the news changes and they don't have it their way, it comes in very quietly. But to cover their bases, there was an article that came out on the wire services, UPI. This is the Houston Post, September 17th. Soviet forgeries. The Soviets are forgers, and there's papers purporting U.S. meddling. And one of the examples was that there are papers circulating around that a secret State Department cable suggested the United States and Italian officials were engineering evidence linking Bulgarian to the shooting of Pope John Paul II. Well, the CIA was in his cell 100 times, and they described the apartment where he was supposed to have been when Mr. Antonov and his wife were not together. His wife was actually in Yugoslavia. That was the first lie that should have broken the whole case. But anyway, now they say, well, if you see any documents, those are forgeries. You know the Russians forged, so don't believe it. Even though the court evidence and a year-long investigation shows that there's nothing to that story. But furthermore, the judge says we'll keep Mr. Antonov in jail maybe up to 5 years if we need to. They won't release him tomorrow because he knows he's innocent. And he knows the people that were interviewing him and lying about him. So they can't afford to let him out, even though he's innocent. So they said we could keep him in 5 years. Now, I found another foundation. Oh, before I get to that, I want to mention the data bank. One article that was a long time ago in Penthouse magazine that is very pertinent. It's called The Hidden Spy Budget and Visualize the Year and the Inflation Now. The New York Times reporter Ted Zulk says that the United States spends incredible $25 billion a year for intelligence gathering services. This was in 1975. That's about 8 years ago. They were spending $22 billion. Zulk, writing for the June edition of Penthouse, claims that the money is spent to support 200,000 U.S. spies and sophisticated worldwide electronic spying networks, such as Western Goals with Edward Tell and Admiral Moore and Larry McDonald. Okay? Zulk's figures indicate that out of every $100 spent by the U.S. government, $8 goes for spying purposes. He said it is hidden in the defense budget. The largest amount is $11 billion a year. Then it goes the national security budget, the National Security Agency, a lesser to the CIA, part to the FBI, part to the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is Daniel Graham, and to the Treasury Department. And it's the Treasury Department that hired Mr. Caulfield and G. Gordon Liddy and the assassination teams that come out of the Treasury Department. This article from 1975 goes on to say that the multi-billion-dollar U.S. intelligence gathering network is under the control of one man, Henry Kissinger. He writes, Kissinger resents having to answer for his actions to anybody except possibly the president. So is it any wonder that Daniel Graham and Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer are close today? They've been bonded, going way back to Oberammergau and to Hitler's Germany. Now, Daniel Graham isn't through. You know, he's a busy man. He's with the High Frontiers. He's with Western Goals. He's with his trade office with Fritz Kramer. Now, I got another piece of action of General Daniel Graham, and you can write to him if you want. He's got a new committee called Leadership Foundation, and it's to stop the illegal drug trade. Imagine the Nugan Bank being the top admirals and generals and a Central Intelligence Agency with heroin and cocaine, and they haven't even pinned them down. He wants to stop the drug crime. Leadership Foundation is on Dulles Road. That's named for Allen Dulles, who took over all of Vietnam and kicked the French out so they could escalate the drugs into this country. P.O. Box 17418, Washington, D.C. 20041. With him on this dummy front intelligence operation is Senator Orrin Hatch, one of the most oppressive senators in the entire Congress, and Major General George Keegan, who's been pushing for World War III for the past 4 or 5 years going around the country, Senator Jesse Helms, and many of you know what a darling he is, and Dr. Norman Turr, T-U-R-E, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Now, the ironic thing is that Jesse Helms was holding up the appointment of Mr. Mullen as the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. He didn't want him for a whole year to be in because he withheld from the Senate the information that our Secretary of Labor, Raymond Donovan, had links to organized crime, and he knew it. So he couldn't be appointed for a year. And there was another thing that Orrin Hatch didn't like, the senator from Utah, but last week he cleared Mullen for the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. At the same time, he's running a drug crime office with the top military brass and the top fascists of the Congress. He has gone ahead with the approval of Francis Mullen. Now, this is from the Washington Post. The Judiciary Committee yesterday voted 14-3 to recommend Senate confirmation for the long-delayed appointment of Francis Bud Mullen Jr. as head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. Senator Orrin Hatch pressed both avenues of inquiry in a 12-page statement and has now resolved all doubts about Mr. Mullen. A special study that Hatch ordered as chairman of the Senate Labor Committee concluded last May that the FBI withheld pertinent allegations from the committee in its consideration of Donovan nomination, and that Mullen, as well as other FBI officials, displayed their lack of care and candor in pursuing the ties between Donovan and organized crime figures. In July, Orrin Hatch said he came across several documents concerning Mullen's dealings while he was an agent in charge of the New Orleans office. New Orleans FBI office is Carlos Marcello. and his relationship with Victor J. Loda, a New Orleans bank official. Later, this bank official was convicted of embezzling funds for a drug ring and reputed organized crime activities. Now, Loda did the paperwork at the New Orleans bank for a housing loan to Mr. Mullen, and he concealed it by using the name Bud Mullen rather than Francis J. Mullen, and he concealed it because he wanted the lending. He didn't want to take the lending limit of $100,000, and he loaned the FBI agent in New Orleans money from his bank. Then he was convicted of being with reputed organized crime figures and part of a drug ring. And this Mr. Mullen is now cleared to be head of Drug Enforcement Agency the same week that a man is going to jail for 25 years for saying he killed Mr. Maselli because he was a witness before the FBI investigating Raymond Donovan, and he had to be killed. So Orrin Hatch not only releases Mullen and says, go ahead and put him as head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. That's bad enough. But then he heads this committee, and he says, petition U.S. Attorney General William French Smith to stop drug crime. Well, Smith works with Paul Axel from Las Vegas, and Smith is the lawyer of the Gibson, Dunn, and Crutch that is in charge of the Los Angeles Police Department, defending them in their suit, the police agents and Western Goals, and taking their material to Washington, D.C. and back to the top officials. General Graham, the stolen material that William French Smith is supposed to be defending while he's the Attorney General, his law firm, goes into a computer back to General Graham, who has his drug operation. The name of the data bank computer operation for filling up those space stations, if you want to know the truth, is terrorism and drugs, and that is going to be the key to rounding up people under the excuse of terrorism and drug. But how do you rationalize the appointment of Mr. Mullen at this time and Orrin Hatch pursuing these avenues and then putting Mullen in charge of the Drug Enforcement Agency? Now, one last thing before the hour is up. Mr. William Casey got a medal this week as a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to too many people. The CIA director got a medal, a special hurried meeting because, in quote, under his guidance and direction, the CIA agency has been strengthened and its health restored. Well, they're flying planes openly down to Guatemala and Nicaragua and Honduras and Lebanon and all over the world. Their policies, their faith has been restored. He says the medal goes for him for his unique insight into the needs of our policymakers. You see, without that 007 going down, the Korean KCIA and RCIA, they wouldn't get through that missile budget, and they wouldn't get through the binary nerve gas. He says, you have insight, unique insight into the needs of our policymakers and brought imagination to our operations and reliance to our analysis. He brought imaginations. Andropov said that the Soviet Union, as a total group with their espionage systems and analysis, thought analyzed 007 as being the most sophisticated espionage operation that had ever come about. Definitely he brought imagination. The CIA said he did, and the head of the KGB and head of the Soviet Union said he did, and he got a medal because all the things that Ronald Reagan wants, he got because of Flight 007 going down, besides getting Vicky Morgan tapes off his neck and blackmail and things that he's got to cover his bases for later on. Well, I've got to stop now. That clock is really ticking away. We got 10 seconds. I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.